in every human society, there is a rule that is trained into us from childhood. You don't have to install it. It's already been installed by years and years of socialization. You just have to trigger it.
I'm Stan Christensen, and this is All Things Negotiation. My guest today is Robert Cialdini. Robert is one of the most influential and most well-known professors in the country. He teaches at Arizona State, and his topic is influence, which is the same title as his book, Influence, that sold over 5 million copies. I've been excited to get him on the show. I'm so excited for our conversation. We talk broadly about how to be influential in your lives, whether in your personal, business, or social relationships. We address issues like how to get a job, who the most influential people are in his life, and how to deal with people who are difficult and influence them to take a different path. I think you'll really enjoy the conversation. Robert Cialdini, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Stan. I'm very happy to be with you.
You are a unique person in that you're an academic superstar. And, we tend to know sports heroes and music heroes, but not academic heroes. And I'm excited about this. As you and I have talked in the past, your area, which is influence, is tightly aligned with my area, which is negotiation. And first question, I'd just love to know your thoughts on the difference between negotiation and influence, or the alignment of those two terms. How do you think about influence?
Well, I think there's a very close alignment because we're always negotiating. It's not just two people or two teams in a room. We're negotiating with our friends, with our family members, with our coworkers, and so on, and just arranging for them to move in our direction when that may not be the case at this point. So we're always looking for a way to influence their choices.
I want to dive into the framework in your book, Influence, and I want to start by the principle of liking. And so I'd love it if you would, for listeners, define what these principles are, so define what liking is. And then maybe to start with, how can negotiators, in a high-stakes negotiation, how do you build rapport quickly?
Sure, of course. Liking means a sense of rapport, a sense of approval of another person, recognizing that person's approval for you, and a strong relationship, a strong personal relationship with that individual. And how do you achieve it? There are a couple of small things that we're able to do to create that sense of rapport even before we begin an interaction or exchange with that person. One is to identify genuine similarities that we have with that person. Oh, you like Korean food? I like Korean food. Oh, you're a firstborn? I'm a firstborn. Those kinds of things. In fact, in a negotiation study, people were negotiating online on a difficult business problem. And when they were just told to do that, just go ahead and find a solution to the problem. In 30% of the cases, there was no successful outcome. People just walked away. It was a deadlock negotiation. If, though, ahead of time, they had been asked to send information back and forth to their bargaining partner first about them, where they grew up, what their family size was, what their favorite movies were, and so on, deadlock negotiations dropped to 6% from 30%. And when the researchers looked at this, it turned out that it wasn't the amount of information that was sent back and forth. It wasn't just that you personalized that other individual. It was the number of similarities and parallels that you could find in that information, right? That caused people to give the other individual grace. So that's one thing you can do. The other is to give genuine compliments, true praise, all right, to people. And this is something where this was my weakness. I recall that when I was teaching and had graduate students working together on a research project with me, and somebody would say something especially instructive, I would say to myself, oh, that's a really interesting thing that Joan just said. Or what Bill just described is exactly the right way for us to approach this problem. And I would say it to myself. And I missed all of the goodwill that would go from giving them a genuine compliment. And now I've trained myself. If I ever have something praiseworthy that occurs to me about somebody in an exchange, I move it from my mind to my tongue. And the effect has been remarkable. And there's one particular kind of compliment that you can give that works especially well in negotiations, and that is giving people a compliment that provides a reputation, assigns them a reputation to live up to, that you would like them to. Henry Kissinger, who is sometimes described as the greatest international negotiator of our time from the U.S., was asked, so who was the best negotiator that you ever saw operating? And he said, Anwar Sadat of Egypt. Right? When he would interact in a bargaining situation, he would give the rival negotiator a trait, a compliment for a trait, like when he was dealing with the Israelis after the Six-Day War, and all the power was on the side of the Israelis, and the Egyptians didn't have any. He would say, I'm so glad that I'm dealing with you folks here, because you're known for being fair-minded and caring about those people who are not on top at that particular moment. You've had that experience, and you're known for that. And Kissinger said he would then get it. They would live up to that reputation that he assigned them as a compliment. Well, we can do that too.
I love that. I find that the compliment thing is interesting. I think people don't give compliments often because they're afraid that it will come off as a little bit obsequious or fawning.
Or self-serving, yeah.
Right. But if you genuinely feel, as we should feel, that there is something to compliment in the other side, put it out there. It shows, in my experience, a vulnerability. And I find vulnerability tends to, not always, but tends to beget vulnerability. Is that your experience?
Yes, because of another one of the principles of influence I have, which is reciprocity, reciprocation.
Well, let's move to that. Let's define reciprocity. And as I read your book and reread your book for this episode, I often talk to people I'm advising about negotiations, about getting into the other party's shoes and techniques for that. We often have what we call the giggle test. If it's something that you ask them that makes you laugh to even ask them, it seems so extreme, reciprocally they wouldn't do that thing. And so talk about reciprocity in your framework as it applies to negotiation.
Yeah, so in every human society, there is a rule that is trained into us from childhood, and that is you must not take without giving in return, right? We are obligated to give back to those who have first given to us, right? And in fact, in every human society, we have very nasty names for people who don't play by that rule, right? In English, we call them moochers, right? Mm-hmm. Or takers, or ingrates. And nobody wants to be labeled like that. So they will go to great lengths to give back what you have first provided as a benefit or advantage of some sort for them to conduct themselves in a way that is suitable for them. If you give them something like that puts them in a position to want to give back to you. The implication is we have to go first. We have to give benefits or information or whatever it is that will that will enhance that person's situation, and that person will want to enhance ours as a consequence, right? You know, I often advise people who are entering a new situation or maybe a new employment situation. If you walk into a room and you see all these people, don't think, who's the person who can most help me here? You should say to yourself, who's the person I can most help here? And provide that assistance, right? You will have generated an advocate for you inside that room or inside that organization, because they will now feel that you are the kind of person who gives and deserves benefits in return.
That makes so much intuitive sense. I think that people tend to do the opposite in negotiation. They often want the other person to give a concession first. And what you're saying is counterintuitive. So drill down a little bit more on that. I think that people have long memories for good deeds. And people aren't always thinking about the relationship in terms of negotiation. The first thing I say, the first day of class in negotiation class, I say, you are taking a class that's about building long-term relationships, not short-term transactions.
Right.
And people get nervous about that, and I tend to convince them throughout the semester that that's true, that you see people again, that it's about expanding the pie rather than dividing up the pie. But why is that people are afraid to go first and take that risk?
They're afraid of being taken advantage of, right? But what they don't recognize is if you go first of all, you should make an offer first, and then you should be willing to make a concession from it, because that will spur a return concession. But by going first, you've framed the issue in terms of what it is that you're choosing to make a concession, and you've determined the size of that concession. You've been in charge of that concession and framing it, forging it in a way that is what you're looking for in return. If what you want in return is respect, begin with respect. If you want more information from these people, begin by giving them more information. Right? That's the rule. You don't have to install it. It's already been installed by years and years of socialization in this culture. Right? You just have to trigger it. You just have to be in a position to engage that power that's already residing in that individual and that person's enculturation.
I guess one pushback I'd have on that, and we may see this differently, when you start to make concessions, I find that it sometimes gets you out of the joint problem-solving space, and you might make a tiny concession, and they might make a tiny concession, when reality is negotiations about problem-solving and creativity. And once you start down the concession path, it can sometimes get in the way. Now, maybe we're just having a difference in terminology. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I don't think you should use concessions as the only, weapon or exercise or practice that you have. But I like the idea of making a concession and then using this technique that we talked about before, asking that person, "What can you give me your advice?" Instead of, "What can you do for me?" Give me your advice on what would be a suitable concession on your part. Ask them to, and it then becomes a mutual problem-solving experience.
Yeah, I like that. Let's go into the third element in your framework, which is social proof. How can social proof be used in negotiation when dealing with someone who is skeptical? Often your counterpart will come to a negotiation skeptical. And so one of the things I talk about is bringing third-party data, objective criteria in to be persuasive. But talk about social proof a bit.
One of the things that spurs people to move in your direction is to give them evidence of others like them who have moved in the direction that you're recommending in the past with other exchanges, or not even those that have involved you, but in other negotiations that you've talked about. And a simple way to do that inside what you have to offer is to tell them what's the most popular of the options that you are offering to people. Which is the most popular of these various candidates for you to move? Give them the popularity information. That shows them social proof. This is what a lot of other people in your situation have chosen to do. There was a great study at McDonald's that showed how just telling people what's the most popular option of something they typically didn't want to do made them then more likely to do that thing. So McDonald's, of course, they make most of their money. People come in to buy sandwiches and fries and a drink, but they have desserts, right? They have a cookie, they have a hot pie, they have.
Don't forget the McFlurry.
Yeah,
the McFlurry is a big one.
That's the big one. That's the one that they really want people, right? So what they did in this one experiment is say, would you like a dessert? That was the control group. The other was, would you like a dessert? The McFlurry is our most popular here. And it increased purchases of dessert, almost entirely McFlurry, by 45%. No, excuse me, 55%.
Wow.
By just telling them what was the most popular of the various options that they have.
Corollary to that, I'm thinking of a restaurant I was at recently, and they were talking about entrees, and the waiter said, well, I think I only have one or two of the salmon left. I could grab that for you if you really want it. Same thing, right? It's sort of like that was popular. People were ordering it. I can get you the last one.
Wow.
And I felt a little beguiled by that.
Well, you just hit on something. That was a really good point that you made, because it is one of the other principles of influence called scarcity. We want those things that we can have. We want more of those things we can have less of. But in this case, you coupled it with social proof. It's scarce because so many people have already chosen it, right? So that you get the double action of this. There's a study that I love that makes this point too. So what do you say when you tell people they can't have it? You can say, not currently available, or not available at this time, some kind of language like that, right? If instead you say sold out, you get significantly more people getting on the waiting list for it. You because it's not available. That could be because of a manufacturing glitch or a transportation problem or weather or something. But if you tell them sold out, not only do you have the scarcity principle, you've got the social proof working for you now, right? And that produces the greatest effect.
Let's pick up on one of the things that I get asked out about all the time, which is social media and its role in validating products or services. What do you see as the either the strengths or the pitfalls of social media as we think about social proof?
It's very important because one of the optimizers of social proof is not just how many people are doing something that you would like the recipient of your message to do, but how comparable those people are to you, right? And what the research shows is that if the social proof involves individuals like them or in their network, they're significantly more likely to comply with a request or recommendation. Right? So that's the thing that we have to optimize is not just a lot of other people, but a lot of people in your circumstance, right? In your situation or in your network, right? Those people, the comparability makes a big difference.
Interesting, because I think the influencers, let's take some obvious ones, an athlete recommending a shampoo or the Kardashians recommending what car to buy. They're neither in our network, nor do they have expertise in the area yet. People are paying them to hawk those products. Right. So help us unwind that a little bit.
That's the liking principle. That's not, that's not credibility there. It's not that. It's that they have a positive feeling toward that individual, that athlete, that celebrity. And that's what spurs it, rather than credibility.
Interesting.
But again, if we're going to stay with scarcity, I think there's a couple of instances where I've really seen it work very powerfully. One is a commercial one, and one is a negotiation. The commercial one was the Bose Acoustics Corporation had a new product a few years ago called the Bose Wave Music System. And they had some advertising for it. They said, the Bose Wave Music System, new features, new benefits, new sophistication, and so on. Okay. And it wasn't doing very well. So they asked us, our team, to come in and change that ad. And we looked at it and said, actually, no, this is a good ad. People want all that information that's there in the ad. Bose buyers aren't impulsive, spontaneous, spur of the moment people. They want that information. But we're going to ask you to change the heading. Instead of saying new, say, hear what you've been missing. The idea of loss is central to scarcity. The fact that you will lose something if you can't get it, right? Because loss is the ultimate form of scarcity, right? Makes people kind of crazy to have it. So this fits with the research of Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago in his prospect theory, that showed that the prospect of gaining something of value is not as motivating as the prospect of losing that same thing, right? So if you can arrange for people to see that they will lose something and mention what will be foregone, what will be missed, that is more motivating to get them to move in your direction than telling them what they will gain from that same thing. Now, that's not to say you never mention gain, but you shouldn't forget to mention what will be foregone, what will be missed. That's the bigger motivator.
It's such a good articulation of loss aversion. Just to mention briefly for listeners, Michael Lewis wrote a great book about the relationship between Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and I'll put that in the notes. But the two of them working together and having a career in academics, and one of their big ideas, well articulated by you, is essentially the power of loss aversion.
Here's another one. It turns out there's research to show that PGA professional golfers, when they are lining up a putt, all right, will spend more time lining it up and getting it right if the putt will cause them to lose a stroke to par than if it would cause them to gain a stroke on par.
That's so good. Let's move on to authority, another principle in your framework. I find that people in negotiation often think about authority in a disempowering way. If the other person has more authority, I need to concede. And obviously, people will ask me who are the greatest negotiators of all time, and I'll come up with examples like Gandhi in India, who didn't start off with a lot of authority, but was able to amass it. So talk about authority in the context of negotiation. That would be helpful for listeners.
Yeah, I think it is important to authority, and people tend to defer to those who have more experience or credentials in an area. But we don't have to. We can say, on this particular issue, I've done my research, and I have generated a sense of what's right and wrong and plausible and feasible and so on. So just your background isn't enough. You have to remember that I can match that. It's also the case that you shouldn't be cowed by authority, because decisions are made for many more reasons than just the messenger. There are reasons having to do with the message and the emotions of the situation, right? If you're going to make an offer to somebody, a numerical offer, make it a precise number, not a round number. Because if you make it a precise number, they know that you've done your homework, that you have credibility, you've figured it out, and it's down to the dollar rather than the $1,000 level.
Interesting. On authority, one thing we face in today's society is people don't know who to trust. They're skeptical of information. I'm thinking of, ever since the pandemic, I think I've thought a lot about health information and how we get our information. Obviously, we had, conspiracies that bubbled up. I'd never been aware of so many conspiracies until the pandemic. Talk about that, of how you distinguish who is a proper authority.
Well, I would ask a couple of questions. Is this person truly an authority? So, for example, you gave an example of some celebrity pitching a product. What does Matthew McConaughey really know about Chryslers? He's not an authority. That gives you away. But then ask, is this person an authority on the topic that we're talking about, right? And then finally, is there a reason that this person who is an authority on the topic might not be giving me the straightest advice because they're being paid to do it? Ask those three questions and see if this person passes all three, and then you'd be more likely to want to listen.
Let's talk a little bit about implementation. One thing I say in my class is it doesn't matter how sophisticated your agreement is if it's not implementable. Yeah. And consistency is something that you talk about in your book. I'm thinking of one story you told me, I don't know if you remember this one, about the Chicago restaurant. Would that be worth retelling?
Yes. So people want to live up to what they have previously said or done. In other words, have committed themselves to publicly, especially in your presence. And the study was done in Chicago. Gordon's Restaurant was the name of it. And Mr. Gordon Sinclair was the owner of the restaurant. And he was a student of the influence process. And he had a problem, no-shows. People who would book a table, and then not appear, and they didn't call ahead to cancel or change their reservation. So he went and listened to what his receptionist was saying when she took a reservation. And she would say, "Thank you for calling Gordon's Restaurant. Please call if you have to change or cancel your reservation." Right? You've heard that a million times, right?
Yep.
What Gordon asked her to do was to add two words. "Will you please call if you have to change or cancel your reservation?" And then to pause. How would you fill that pause if you were on the other end? What would you say if I asked you, will you call if you have? People say, "Yes, of course, I'm glad to."
Absolutely, I'll call.
And that's the commitment. And no shows at Gordon's Restaurant dropped by 65% that day and never went back up, because the pause was crucial. Getting people to make an active, public, voluntary commitment to doing this then spurred them to follow through on that commitment.
Love that. That's kind of a quick tour through the 7 elements. You started by talking about unity, and I've had a question in my mind since you started there that I wanted to come back to. We live in a society that's fairly tribal right now. Certainly politically, we seem to be locked into some tribes. What if you have someone who's really dug in on their issue, they're intransigent, they're inflexible, and they reject what you say? How do you get them to come off that position?
Yeah, and the one that has worked for me is to use concentrated listening skills. In other words, listen in a focused way to what they have to say. Don't be looking around or checking your watch or anything. No, focused, concentrated listening to what they have to say. Take notes, because you're signaling that you consider this important enough to register and to keep in mind for your own purposes. And then finally, ask non-evaluative questions, right? Not, why in the world would you believe this? But what were the circumstances that got you to believe this? What do you think is important about this set of issues, and so on? And then, when they've said their piece, pause, nod, and say, well, let me give you my view. And now it's their turn. By the rule for reciprocity, it's their turn to listen, their turn to be open-minded and receptive. And you can get your points in under those circumstances. I did that with my brother a few years ago with a particular political election, and where he and I were very different in our starting points. I let him make his case. I did exactly what I recommended. And then it was my turn, and he did change. He did flip over to my side, because rather than just rejecting or deflecting my message, he was open to it because I had been open to his.
I find that people tend to, in those difficult conversations, sometimes interrupt each other and not be able to pause. And the second thing is, I think they're not very good at these non-evaluative questions. So can you just give us a few examples in that situation with your brother? What would be examples of non-evaluative questions?
Yeah. So I would say you've come to this position. What were the circumstances that brought you there? What were the pieces of evidence or your observations that got you to that position? Then I would say, well, this is do you recognize the importance of voting for one person versus another, for one person who had this? Is that an important reason for you to care about this issue? Yes, it's important, and he would say, of course, caring about this set of issues is important, right? Those are the kinds of questions I would ask. So then when I had points to make with evidence about issues that he was committed to caring about, that was an especially effective strategy.
It feels like, particularly, everyone's picking on Congress these days in terms of them not sort of standing up to the executive branch of the government. What would your advice be to a congressman? You're essentially saying, hey, you should put country over party. Currently, most Congress people are choosing party over country. So how do you get them up to that higher level commitment?
Yeah, well, I think the most effective ways, I think, are to point out of a different, so a commitment to their constituencies, their the people who they are serving in their local arenas. Right? Remind them of that commitment and the consequences of the policy for the well-being of their constituents.
Excellent. Well, I want to move on in the time we have remaining to your second book, and it's fascinating to me. So this book is called Persuasion, A Revolutionary Way to Influence People. So it's essentially, if we put that into negotiation terminology, how do you prepare for the negotiation? Is that right?
That's exactly right. The great Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu said, every battle is won before it's fought. It's how we prepare for it, how we arrange things so that when we make our case, right, our assault in his terms, the situation has been readied for it.
I love that so much. And I'm just going to interject one point, which is I push students to prepare for negotiation. And one thing I say is rarely do people prepare and rarely do they use a framework. And so if you prepare and you use a framework, by definition, you're going to do well against your counterpart. Because unlike the military campaigns that you reference, probably both sides are prepared to some extent. The better prepared side is going to do better. But in negotiation, it's a freebie because the other side tends not to prepare. Is that your experience?
It is my experience. And it's something I have tried to incorporate even into my teaching. You know, I would teach the same class every year. I teach a class on introductory social psychology or persuasion and influence. And I had my notes and I would update the notes and so on. But essentially it was pretty much the same class 1 year after I taught it previously. But if I didn't prepare the night before, even though I had taught that class in the past, even though I had it in my muscle memory, if I didn't prepare the night before, it wasn't as good. I'd miss things, especially the transitions between this idea, this section of my lecture and the next section of my lecture. I would miss. And so without that preparation, you don't optimize your success.
I love that. I've been teaching for 23 years. How many years have you been teaching?
40.
40. So almost double what I've been doing. And I just couldn't agree more that if you spend just even an extra half hour before the class, you do so much better job for the students. And I think a lot of professors get lazy and don't do that. So I just admire that you're a fellow preparer.
Yeah, right.
And now you've given me the job for the next 17 years. I need to follow your example.
Yeah, right.
Let's highlight a couple of ideas from Persuasion, two that jumped out to me. And it's just an excellent book and I couldn't recommend it more. It has also sold almost 5 million copies. And so social proof is there and people should read it. You talk about this idea of priming. Tell listeners what priming means.
It means, you know how so let's say you want to paint a wall in your house, right? If you just put paint on it, very often the wall doesn't accept it very well. But if you put primer on first, then it accepts the paint. I like to think about it in agricultural terms. Cultivating the earth before you put a seed into it, right? If you don't cultivate the earth, that seed is not going to bloom, is not going to grow optimally. If you do the work ahead of time so that it's receptive, the ground is receptive to your seed, then it's going to work. You know, there's an old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, right? You can't get that skeptical or resistant horse to drink if it doesn't want to, right? So forcing it doesn't work. But here's what does work. Exercise the horse ahead of time or feed the horse ahead of time. Do something prior. And then the horse wants to drink, right? There's a study done of a company that was a furniture company, and they sold furniture online, right? And so what they do is they welcome people on their landing page and then show them the various candidates of sofas that they have available. In this study, for 1 week, everybody who came to their website, half of them were sent to a landing page that had fluffy clouds in the background of that welcoming statement. The other half were sent to a landing page that had small coins, pennies, in the background. And then they introduced people to the array of candidates of possibilities. Right? It turns out those people who had come to a page with fluffy clouds first, right, preferred to buy more comfortable furniture. Those people who were sent to the landing page with pennies preferred to buy less expensive furniture. Where you put them in terms of state of mind that they were in, what concept did you give them, caused them to search for and select those types of entities, right? So my advice for how to use persuasion is find what you think is your strongest element in your case. Is it durability? Is it comfort? Is it price? Is it scientific evidence in favor? Right? And provide ahead of time an image or wording or a concept that puts people in mind of that element, that idea, right? They will be primed to receive that idea once they then encounter it in your message. A study was done by Norwegian Cruise Lines. They had a deal for their prior customers, but it was a time-limited deal. So they sent out an email, and for half of them, there were 2 ticking clock emojis in the subject line of the email. The other half didn't get those clocks ticking down, right? They were put in mind of dwindling opportunity before they got to dwindling opportunity. And those people were 15% more likely to buy the cruise package.
Amazing. Well, we're almost out of time. I wanted to ask a couple of specific questions that I often ask people. Who that people would recognize, a public figure, do you think has been particularly good at the things that you teach, influence? Anyone that's just a super influencer that you can think of, and why?
Yes, Warren Buffett, who is probably the most successful financial investor of our time. He's taken Berkshire Hathaway to these astronomical levels. How does he do that? Well, he's a brilliant investor, but he's also a brilliant communicator about his investments and his company. And so what he does on his letters to shareholders every year, he tells them about what happened last year and what the strengths of the company are going forward. But before he does that, he mentions something that went wrong that year, a mistake that they made.
They lead with the mistakes.
He leads with a mistake on the first or second page, something that went wrong. And then he says, but we've learned from that, right? And he establishes credibility by saying, to people, I'm going to tell you, I'm just not going to pull a blanket of positivity over you. I'll tell you what went wrong too. He establishes himself as a credible source of information. And then he says, but here's what went right this year. And I've been getting his letters for about 25 years. And every time he does that, I say to myself, wow, this guy is being straight with us. What does he say about the wisdom of keeping my Berkshire Hathaway stock and buying some new Berkshire Hathaway stock. And I believe that more deeply because he first establishes himself as an honest broker of information.
Ties in nicely with what we talked about before about connecting and connecting through vulnerability, as opposed to we've made no mistakes. And people just don't buy that. It's really human to express that vulnerability. So I love your example.
There's even a study that if you have made a mistake and you say it was our fault versus, oh, it was some external factor like weather, right?
Yeah, I find blame doesn't work very well, and apologies often work.
Yeah.
And I say to students, all of you do things every day that you should be apologizing for. Learn to be a good apologizer. Let me wrap up with one question that young people always want to know more about, which is how do they persuade employers, potential employers, that they're a good candidate for the job? So what would be your advice when you are self-promoting through persuasion in a job interview?
Yes. So I actually have an acquaintance who told me the story of how he wasn't very successful in he was in a job he didn't like very much. He would recruit for other jobs and he would get interviews, but he wasn't very successful. And then he tried a strategy that works exactly in this way. He said, I'm so glad that you invited me, and I want to answer all your questions, but I wonder if you could answer a question for me. I'm curious. Why did you invite me here today? What was it about my background, my CV, my experiences that made me an attractive candidate? And he said, you talk about commitment and consistency, then you will hear them commit themselves to your strengths out loud. They will publicly commit themselves to why they thought you were. And he said, I've gotten 3 better jobs in a row using that strategy.
Nice. I think I've said before on the podcast, the art of negotiation, an Italian diplomat once said, is the art of letting them have your way. And that's a nice illustration
that's a great
of that.
Phrasing it.
Well, I want to mention just quickly as we wrap up what you're currently doing in teaching persuasion and influence through the Cialdini Institute. I'm going to include a link to the Cialdini Institute in the notes, which is people can essentially take online courses. There are 119 recorded lectures. They can get a coach. And what you're doing there that I find so impressive as another person trying to teach people his topic is you're making it accessible to everybody, and they can go as deep and as broad as they want. And so I just want to congratulate you for creating that, because it even goes beyond the 10 million books that you have sold, if that weren't already enough influence. Anything briefly you'd like to say about that before we close?
Well, the other thing about that is that we specialize in ethical influence. How can you be effective in moving people in your direction and ethical at the same time? That's, I think, our major differentiator.
You've been teaching influence for a long time, and I'd just love to know any tricks as a fellow teacher. What have you learned throughout your career about the most effective ways to teach influence to students?
It turns out it is to begin with a puzzle, some mystery of human behavior, and say, how do we possibly account for this? That people would do this under these circumstances. So give them a poser, give them a puzzle that you tell them that they will be able to solve if they pay attention to all of the material that we're about to give them in the teaching experience. And that because there is something called a need for closure in human phenomenology. We need, when we have something that's a mystery or a puzzle, we need to get closure on it. So, for example, in my own teaching and writing, one of the principles of influence is the sense in which people feel a sense of unity with one another, commonality of place or identity. And, you find that those things, commonality of place, make a big difference in people's decisions to align with somebody else. Oh, you're from my neighborhood. You're from my community. If you're traveling overseas, oh, you're an American. Me too. This sort of thing. It brings down the barriers to influence. And if you start with puzzles regarding that, how could that be? Why would that be? You get people paying attention.
Another thing that we've talked about in comparing notes on our teaching is that, on the one hand, frameworks are important, and we're going to get into the framework from the book Influence, but people need to be able to focus on small changes and small steps.
Yeah, I think if we're going to try to be more effective, and especially if we want to teach and train people in our teams or our clients and so on to be more effective in negotiation or influence in general, we have to be able to give them changes that they can make that are effective, but don't require large-scale investments of time or energy or cost to do that, because that's just asking too much of them frequently. So what we're focusing on these days is what we call small bigs. Small change. You can change a word or the sequence of your wording in a message or a communication that you provide. So, for example, suppose you have a colleague and you would like to get that person's buy-in on an idea that you have before you send it up the line to get it adopted. You would like to get that person's buy-in. And you would provide maybe an outline of the idea or a blueprint or a summary of it. And you would say, can you give me your opinion on this? Right? It turns out asking to get buy-in is a good idea, but asking for that person's opinion is a mistake. When you ask for an opinion, you get a critic. You get someone who steps back from you, separates, goes inside themselves, and provides a critique, right, in their minds. And if instead you ask for that person's advice, you get a partner in the process, someone who is engaged in helping you get through this, and not only and helping you with your idea, right? And the research is very clear on this. If you use the word advice rather than opinion, not only do you get a more favorable response to your idea, you get better input from them to hone it and make it a better idea, because you've made them part of the process instead of separating and just providing a critique of it. Here's another one. Suppose you're getting your team ready for to reach some sort of goal, and they've been working at it and have covered some ground and gotten, let's say, halfway there at a good speed. And what we're typically told to do is to congratulate them on that. But if you congratulate them on their progress, that's a mistake, because what you have done is to cause them to look back at all the effort that they've already done, and they tend to stop pedaling and start coasting because they've already done all of this. You've focused them on what they've already generated, and time for me now. Maybe I'll get on Facebook right. If you change one word and congratulate them on their commitment to the goal, not their progress to it, they keep working at the same pace because you focus them on what has to occur next and their existing commitment to making sure that goal works. And once again, this isn't just my opinion. This is evidence. There's research, solid scientific research that says change those words and you get big shifts in the outcomes that you're looking for.
Love it. Well, Robert Cialdini, thanks so much. It's been a great conversation. I knew it would be, and I just appreciate so much your time because I know you are under high demand.
Well, I enjoyed it, Stan.
Thanks so much. Thanks for listening to All Things Negotiation. Please subscribe to the show on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. If you enjoyed the show, tell a friend, and be sure to engage with us on social media. Your likes, comments, and reposts make a big difference and help others find the show. The show was produced by Ezra Trupiano, original music by Peter Breinhold, and designed by Aubrey Benson. Thanks for listening.